Hello, family. This is a great opportunity that I wanted to take to just put down, or I was going to say on paper, but on film, just some of the experiences that I've had that have been meaningful in my life, and that I would really like each of you to have a record of those. And this particular one is the trip that I had, 2.5 years that I spent in the South Pacific and sailing across the Pacific Ocean in a 20-foot 6-inch sailboat. And so just to give you a little bit of background, just after I'd finished university, I decided to travel. And I traveled to Papua New Guinea because my friend and roommate, David Smith, had been sent there with QSO for 2 years. And originally he was supposed to have gone to Tanzania, but was redirected to Papua New Guinea. And so I decided I would go down and spend 6 months or so visiting him and checking out Papua New Guinea, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, that 6 months turned into 2.5 years. Yeah, it was February '73 is when I left home and had my return plane tickets to Papua New Guinea, Australia, and New Zealand, and actually flew to Australia, to Sydney, Australia, and ended up sleeping in the airport my first night there. But I just remember that as I was flying across the Pacific Ocean and looking down, I just was amazed and could not fathom how people could have ever have sailed a boat across there without knowing where they were going. And so was just a little amazed after spending hours and hours of flying. I thought anybody down there in a boat originally when they were sailing across must have been had a lot of faith or a lot of drive to continue going when it seemed endlessly the same. But anyway, I arrived in Sydney, Australia, and I hitchhiked up the east coast of Australia to Cairns and flew to Mount Hagen, Papua New Guinea, up in the highlands, and spent 4.5 months up there with David and going out to Sing Sings and Pig Kills and a bunch of activities with the native population. I just had a wonderful time. Did a bunch of hiking with David and some friends, but then returned after 4.5 months. Returned to Australia and hitchhiked out through Mount Isa and down Tennant Creek, down to Ayers Rock and through the center, and ended up spending working for 3 months in Sydney, renovating a picture frame factory, and then I headed down to Tasmania and had some great experiences down there, falling off of mountains, and but primarily I ran a youth hostel for about 6 weeks and spent 3 months in Tasmania in Bishono. That was great. Following my stint in Tasmania, I decided that I was going to go to New Zealand, and I was going to work in Tongariro National Park, although I had no idea exactly where that was or what that was. But I flew over to New Zealand and hiked around for about 3 months. Everywhere I went on my own. Was not very safety conscious, but I spent time doing a lot of hiking. I must have hiked about 450 miles in New Zealand through many of their national parks, and just had a wonderful time there. But as I say, I was just trotting around New Zealand and had heard that David had bought this this yacht, and so I immediately wrote him, or I kept telling him that he wrote me and asked me to sail with him, but he reminded me just this year that it was I who actually had heard about him having a boat and wrote him and said, I was coming. And he accepted that offer, and it wasn't until later that I actually found out just the size of the boat, the 21 feet 6 inches. It was a replica of Trekka, John Guswell's boat that was built by or designed by Lawrence Giles in England, and it was the smallest sailboat to circumnavigate the world at the time. And it was our particular boat, Tiki, was built in Papua New Guinea out of New Guinea teak or garamut, and it had fiberglass cover over that. But she was a great little boat, but I wouldn't see her for some time because David had said, well, he had asked me to stay in New Zealand and find some work, so that he could send me a list of the supplies that we needed and all the gadgets and the items that we required, and the tables and sextant and all these things for celestial navigation, because they weren't really available in Papua New Guinea at all, and they would take way too long if he put in an order from Papua New Guinea. Things take months and months and months to get there, and so having me in New Zealand, where there were lots of yacht supplies, was a bonus. And so I had been in the South Island at that point, but had worked my way up to the North Island then, and I ended up going to Tongariro National Park. And the third day that I was there, I was in the Scotel, which is like a youth hostel, at the base of Mount Ruapeo. Ruapeo erupted. It was a volcano, and it wiped out the ski lifts, or some of the ski lifts, a few of the towers, and the machinery. And so I got a job repairing ski lifts. So I got to splice cable and clean up, dig out mud and muck from some of the huts and the equipment because of all the stuff that slid down in the volcano. But and worked at that for some time, and then continued on as a ski lift operator. Got to run pommel lifts and chairlifts, and did a lot of de-icing and knocking the ice off the cables, because it's very, very mild and close to the ocean, and so almost every day we had to knock the ice off the cables. But continued there and keeping in touch with David, and the folks at the Ruapeo Alpine Lifts, they thought I was crazy. They called me the crazy Canadian, partly because of the way I skied, and also thinking that anybody would ride a little boat like Tiki to take it back to Canada. It was pretty strange to them. But I left New Zealand in early October of 75, and flew back to Australia, hitchhiked again up through Australia, and camping by the way all the time, just by the side of the road. Didn't have a tent, I just had a ground sheet in my sleeping bag, and everything went great. But I got up to Cairns again, and then I flew to Madang, and that's where the boat was anchored. And so met David, and we spent from that day on, we lived on the boat and practiced eating and cooking and just living in those kind of quarters, and just anchored in the bay. And that was a great experience. We had a little rubber Avon dinghy we used later as our life raft, but that was what we used as our tender to get back and forth in the meantime. We spent a fair amount of time just getting the boat re-rigged and set up, and all the supplies and things into it. And so we did some work for other folks working on their sailboats. Just David was quite a carpenter and was good at finishing work, and really did a nice job of working on a few sailboats. And so we decided to head off to leave Madang. We left actually on New Year's Eve, 1975, December 31st. Supposedly because it was a bad omen to leave on the 1st. So we headed out on the 31st of December and headed for Madang, and we sailed 4 days, I believe it was, to Garove Island, which is a small horseshoe-shaped atoll between Madang and Rabaul, and spent a few days in that lagoon, just loving the water and being brought fresh fruit. All these native girls and women, and in their canoes they'd bring us pineapples and oranges and lemons and all kinds of fruit, and that was a real treat. And we then headed off to Rabaul, and it was interesting. And on our trip to Rabaul, one night we got caught in a real storm, and it was thunder and lightning, and the lightning was right overhead, and we had up too much sail. Okay, we got caught in this thunderstorm and thunder and lightning, and it was really blowing. We were heeled over, right over on our side. We were doing about as fast as that boat would go, and we had wanted to take down sail, but there was no way that David was going to go up to the mast and grab a hold of that mast, as it was lightning all around. He figures get himself electrocuted. So we just kept on going through the dark, and I just had my I can remember my eyes glued on the compass, just trying to keep a course that we thought we were running between two islands, and we were, but we were scooting along in the dark, couldn't see what we were doing very much. Ended up with squid on the deck. They'd flown through the air and caught in the sail that had been blowing so hard, and so we found those in the morning on the deck when things got light. And as things calmed down, that was our first bit of excitement as we cruised down around into Rabaul, and then we spent some time in Rabaul until I guess about middle of February. In fact, it was up until February the 15th. We had been just again fixing the boat, getting final things readied, and on the 15th of February we had a big send-off, and we headed out of port, and under great wind we were winging it, wind on wing, and just heading out of Rabaul. And within 2 hours our forestay started to unravel. It was stainless steel, and it started to unravel a bit, and we thought, oh well, we'll just go in the lee of the island and fix that, jury rig it or fix it up, and so we continued on, and but about 4 hours into the trip, the starboard cap shroud started to unravel, and so at that point David just looked at me and I looked at him and just shook our heads, didn't say a word, just turned it around and headed back to Rabaul with our heads hung low. So we snuck back into harbor about 9:30 at night. It was dark, and didn't say a word, and a big surprise to everybody to see us tied up to the buoy the next morning. And there was a fellow there that heard of our predicament, and his name was Bob Foote, and he had just re-rigged his boat, and he had some 5/16 galvanized that he had taken off his boat, and he gave it to us, and which was a great blessing, because we had our boat totally re-rigged and ready to go within about 2 weeks. Well, it was actually about 17 days to be exact. But so 17 days later, after re-rigging the whole boat and cutting tangs from a stainless steel French medical boat that was bombed in the Second World War in the harbor there, I cut stainless steel tangs so we could fit our new rigging, and that was quite something. We also built ourselves we had found a Land Rover door and cut that up and made ourselves a radar reflector that we put up on top of the mast so that the boats and the ships would see us on their radar. So we had all this, and we were re-rigged and ready to go. 17 days later, we pulled out of Madang, and this time we did not tell anybody we were going. We just slipped out so that we didn't want to be embarrassed again, and started on what was to be a 19-day voyage to Ponape in the Caroline Islands, basically due north. And we were going up through the equatorial calms because Rabaul is about 4 degrees south of the equator, and but we took us 19 days to get up through the equatorial currents up to Ponape, and that's about a 12-mile diameter island, and it was a good test of our celestial navigation because neither David nor I had known how to do celestial navigation. While I was in New Zealand, I had bought a sextant and the tables and a book by Mary Blewett, and figured out how to do celestial navigation. And so we figured if we could hit a 12-mile diameter island after 19 days of sailing, we should be able to hit North America after a couple months. And so we hadn't really announced to anybody at that point that we were sailing back to Canada. Our friends in Papua New Guinea thought we were just going out to investigate the Marshall Islands and Caroline Islands. But when we got to Pohnpei, and we spent some time there, just again finalizing all our rigging and making sure we had all our food stores and water and everything that we needed. We had no radio communication other than a little FM radio that we could get time signals on, but we didn't have two-way communication. We had no motor or power, so it was wind tassel, as they say in Pidgin English, but we went by the wind only. Yes, and so we found Ponape just off our port bow. As we came in there, just exactly where we had planned, and that was exciting for us because it showed us that our celestial navigation was on target, and we were right where we thought we should be, and it gave us a little bit more confidence as we were going to head across the North Pacific. But we spent some time in Ponape helping a couple re-rig their boat a bit and get it somewhat functional and get all our stores together. And as we did so, we planned our departure so that our timing would be best to try and miss the big storms and the hurricanes and the things that would be happening in Southeast Asia, and yet we knew it would be pretty chilly up in the North Pacific and didn't want to get there too soon. And so it was a balance in terms of our planning to head off. But we pulled out of Ponape April 15th, 1976, and headed through the reef and on our way into the great blue yonder. We spent the first 12 days beating through the northeast trades. We didn't change a sail. We didn't change the self-steering vane. We absolutely didn't touch anything for 12 days straight. In terms of adjusting our sails, the only thing we did was get sick for the first few days. The northeast trades were a little different than the things we'd been in, and it was exciting. But the little Tiki just beat her way through those trades and and up into the horse latitudes, and we did really well. And so we were running a course. We were trying to do a great circle route, which actually we were very close to a great circle route. But that was my job each day, was to do the navigation and to plan our course and chart our course and figure out what was the shortest route home, and to set our bearing and as best we could our sails so that we could follow that bearing. Of course, there were days that we had where it was not all smooth sailing. We would be calmed at times, sitting there and the sun beating down and the sails slapping back and forth, slatting here and going nowhere. But Tiki was a well-balanced little boat, and she would sail on a breath of wind, and so we were very fortunate. Okay, well, there was a number of really delightful things that we were able to see and do at sea. The sea is never changing and yet always changing. It seems to be the same flat glass into forever and ever, and yet there's always waves and changing weather. And one of the nicest things I ever saw was a 360-degree sunset. Could look straight up and it was pure blue sky right above us, and for 360 degrees there was every color of the rainbow. And didn't have a camera to capture it, but would have been nice. But we had sold those to make our way home, and thought we might have ruined them in the salt water. One other exciting experience was, and this was probably before we got to Ponape, but that was we had seen a bunch of activity on the water, and David had always given me a rough time about my fishing and not being able to catch any fish or very little, and we'd never really needed them. But anyway, we saw all this activity on the water, and so I had a little disc with line on it and a lure with a 3-pronged hook, to just sort of a silver weighted lure. And so I just swung this around my head and threw it out into the middle of all this activity on the surface, and all of a sudden, wham, I got hit with a real tug, and then all of a sudden it went slack. And David was laughing at me, a big fisherman, and so I started bringing in the line, and as it got up to the boat, there were 2 6-foot Mako sharks following my lure, and pulled the lure up and looked at it, and one of the prongs had been broken off, and the other 2 were perfectly straight. So I figured that maybe those Mako sharks had taken a swipe at it. Anyway, they followed the lure up, but I wanted to see them again, so I threw my lure back in the water and just let it flash, and those 2 sharks came whipping right back up to the boat to have a look at this flashing lure. And I did this a number of times, and David started getting quite excited about that, because he didn't feel very comfortable with these 2 sharks sitting there, and I was standing on the boat and saying, "Well, what's the problem? We're up here and they're down there." He says, "Yeah, but they can jump out and get you." But I wasn't too worried about it. Anyway, we had a good laugh, and it was a great experience to see these sharks. But it sort of cured our desire to swim. From that point on, we didn't do a whole bunch of swimming in the water. And besides, once we got into the northeast trades, when the boat was moving, we didn't want to be swimming anyway. So that was the big shark story. Well, another interesting story is that David and I had made a pact that we would always clip in if we were up on deck in any kind of weather. And that means that we had a harness that we had built ourselves with a rope attached to it, and we would clip it for a safety line onto the boat. And one morning I woke up and David was getting out on deck, and I stuck my head out of the hatch, and David said he was going forward to put on a smaller jib because the wind was coming up, and we had to shorten sail. And we'd come up into the wind, so we weren't moving. And I asked him, I said, "David, you going to clip in?" He said, "No, I'll be all right." And so he hauled down the jib that was on there and had it sitting on the deck, but he was still holding on the sheet. And the wind caught that sail that was on the deck and opened it just like a parachute. Just threw him off the boat. He must have been 30 feet away from the boat. He just went like a rocket. And he just about walked on water getting back to the boat. But that was a very unsettling experience. I think for David particularly, in the sense that, well, we didn't talk about it much at all, but just the reality of how easy it would be to lose somebody. And if we had been moving through the water, if it had been at night, because we were on 6-hour shifts, 6 on, 6 off, and if one person was down sleeping and the other one was on deck and was lost overboard, it would have been game over. And that was actually my greatest fear, was returning home and having to explain to his mother that I got home, but that David wasn't with me. And just what a sick feeling that would be, and just having her probably wondering if we had been good friends, and or if there had been something that was something that was done that was underhanded or not in keeping with our feelings of friendship. And but David and I, we never had a cross word on our whole trip. We had our moments that we we may not have been in the greatest of moods. At least I know that I had times when that I wasn't in the best of moods, but we always knew and respected one another at times like that, and it was great, and we're friends today, and it's great to touch base with them from time to time and just rehash some of the stories and the experiences that we've had. Well, the real exciting story is the morning that, the night we just hove to, because the wind was coming up. It was getting too rough, and we just battened down the hatches, both climbed in the bunk and went to sleep. And David got up in the morning, and we were lying in our bunks, and we felt the waves crashing over top of the deck and all, and but we felt snug as ever inside our little boat, just bobbing along like a cork. But we felt really good in there, and David stuck his head out about 7:30 in the morning, and when he did so, he said, "We gotta get out of here!" And we were looking up at waves that were higher than our mast, and here we were broadside with these waves that were dumping over top of us, and it got pretty exciting. The old heart was in the throat for a while, and we grabbed the tiller and spun ourselves around, and we just ran dead away from the winds. We put up a storm jib just straight back from the mainstay, the forestay, to the main mast, and just a little handkerchief basically to keep us our nose pointed downwind. And we started surfing down these waves, and our log went up to 15 knots and went right off the end of it as we surfed down these waves. Just picked up the boat and just fired it down them, and that was probably more exhilarating than going 80 miles an hour in a speedboat. It was just something else. But we spent a whole day charging with this wind, and as things, after a full day of this, we decided, oh man, this is fun, and we were looking for bigger waves. Yeah, those waves at the time were, way above the mast, and it looked pretty scary, and you just couldn't figure out how this little boat would ever get to the top of one of those waves, but it just bobbed like a cork, and we felt so secure on that little boat that never really worried about not getting home. But it was pretty exciting. And that storm blew for a while. I think we went for about 3 or 4 days in a southeasterly direction. We weren't headed in the direction we wanted to, but we were just running from the wind. And overall, on the whole trip, there were fewer big storms than what we had expected, but that one caught us by surprise and provided some excitement and obviously a story to tell. The real challenge as we were heading north in the Pacific was that it got pretty chilly. In fact, all the cockroaches died. There wasn't a cockroach left on our boat that survived the cold from up there, but we were in our wool pants and our heavy wool pants and wool sweaters, and we kind of lived in that, and things got pretty ripe because the water in the North Pacific when you're trying to have a bath was like splitting your head open with an axe when you dump the water over you. So we were closer to the Aleutian Islands than we were to the Midway chain. And so I think closest we came to land was about 500 miles. Otherwise, it had been about 5,500 miles from Ponape to Victoria. And that took actually 62 days without seeing land. We were on the water. Well, we saw land at the end because as we came up to Cape Flattery, we went by it 5 times. We were becalmed and went in with the tide and out with the tide, in with the tide, out with the tide, and in with the tide. So that was kind of it was unsettling in a sense because when we were 2,000 miles offshore, the Swiftsure was running and 3 people had died in the Swiftsure off Cape Flattery, and so we were worried that we might be in the same predicament. But when we got there, we were becalmed. But there was no way we were going to ask for a tow into port after we had spent a couple months at sea sailing. And the most moving experience that I had in the whole trip, though, was as I was crossing the international date line, approximately. I finally had taken out Book of Mormon. This Book of Mormon that my sister Mary gave me, that she had sent to me when I was in New Zealand. And she had asked me to read it. And she had joined the church and was heading on a mission, a welfare services mission. And she had sent me the book and figured that she would get back from her mission before I did. She said at the rate that I was going, this was when I was in New Zealand, and had talked about sailing home but didn't know when. And but she had sent me the book and sent me a letter expressing her love for me and the importance of the book in her life. And so I had thrown it in my pack and included it as one of the few books that I had taken on our boat. And after I had been at sea for about a month in that last stretch, I pulled it down off the shelf and started reading it. And I read the first part, Moroni's promise. It tells us to read and study it out and pray about it. And I figured that praying about it, well, that was just to come on to get me to read the book. And so I started reading, and Mary had highlighted some particular verses throughout the book that she thought I should look at, and I did so and was intrigued by that, and then went back to the beginning and started reading, and I couldn't put the book down. I remember reading for 16 hours the first day, and I was feeling something I'd never felt before. I was feeling that I was quite touched by it, and tears came easy. Didn't talk to David about it at all, but sat there and just kept reading. And the second day I was reading in Mosiah, and I remember that all of a sudden I felt this burning in my chest, and tears came to my eyes, and I couldn't read the page, and I kept reading, and just thinking about things I'd read, but continued on, and I still didn't pray about it. And the next day I was in Alma, and I started reading, and a thought came to me, and I said, I guess at that point I didn't know what a prayer was, but I said, well, God, if that feeling that you gave me yesterday was telling me that this book is true, I said, let me feel it again. And immediately, boy, my heart was full. My heart was burning again. And I knew that the Book of Mormon was true. And from that day on, I knew that it was true. But even when David asked me if I would join the church, I told him no, even though I knew that I wanted to. I guess the social aspect of becoming a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was a little bit more than I wanted to face at that point. And yet I knew that I would. I knew I couldn't deny the feelings that I've had, the experiences that I've had. And since that time, many times, I have had a reconfirmation that the Book of Mormon is true, that Joseph Smith is and was a prophet, that he translated it by the gift and power of God, and that my life has been blessed abundantly ever since. There is nothing greater that I have done or experienced than the things that have come because of my acceptance and striving to live the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think the Lord had to put me out there where I couldn't do anything else and sit me out on a boat for a couple of months so I would take the time to read. And I did, and after sailing into Victoria and getting into port, I didn't call home and tell my mother that I'd arrived. I thought I would surprise her, and so I caught a ferry over to Vancouver and took the midnight bus home to Salmon Arm. Got off the bus at about 8:30 in the morning, and 8:30, 9 o'clock, and knew my mother would be at work. She worked at the Human Resources office, and I walked into the office, and the ladies who worked with my mother were hollering at her that Ted was here, for her to come to the counter, and she paid no attention because they had been telling her that with every scruffy-looking fellow that came in with a backpack on over the last 2.5 years, and so she wasn't going to be fooled by it, and so kept filing files and really didn't turn around. And then finally she turned around and came over, and the girls sent her home to make me breakfast. And it was about 6 months later that I actually followed through on my desire and my commitment to join the church, and I did so. I was baptized on the 24th of November in 1976. That was a special day in my life and a great culmination to the experiences that I had on the boat, and just so grateful for for a friend such as David Smith, who would take somebody who had never sailed before in his life and sail across the Pacific Ocean in a 20-foot sailboat. It was a great experience, one that I treasure, and most of all because of what I found as a part of that trip. And I leave you with my testimony that I know that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, that it was translated by the gift and power of God, and that the gospel of Jesus Christ is restored and is upon the earth today with all its power and authority. And this I leave with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.